You have until tomorrow to sell your land, or you'll never set foot on it again. The HOA president's threat echoed as I stared at the concrete wall blocking my only access road. 2 years of savings gone, our dream home impossible. But as I pulled a folder from my glove compartment, a smile spread across my face. These arrogant tyrants had just walked into my perfectly laid trap. Their power play had activated a hidden contingency that would turn their world upside down and cost them what they valued most. Where you watching from, drop your location in the comments when this is over. You'll understand why my father always said the devil's in the details, and why you should never cross someone whose family knows the law better than you do. It all began 14 months ago when I spotted a listing for a gorgeous 3-acre parcel deep within Pinehurst Estates, an upscale neighborhood in California. The price was surprisingly low for such prime real estate, which immediately triggered my suspicion. My father, Bob, a retired real estate attorney, always taught me that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. So I did my due diligence combing through county records and zoning maps. The property had only one potential issue. Its sole access was via a private road running through HOA-managed land. This explained the bargain price, but as a software engineer who'd spent years saving for my dream home, I wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. My father offered to help review the purchase agreement. HOAs can be tricky, he warned, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he examined the documents. They're like little kingdoms with their own laws and enforcers, but don't worry, we'll make sure. Your access rights are ironclad. Dad spent an entire weekend carefully crafting an easement clause granting permanent right-of-way along the private road. He also added several appendices to the contract, including one regarding Lot 2486, the community's artificial lake, though. At the time, I didn't understand its significance. When I questioned him about it, he simply smiled. They're too confident to read what they sign. That's my first lesson to you about real estate law. The HOA had to approve the sale, and I'll never forget my first meeting with Diane Foster, the HOA president. She was in her early 50s, immaculately dressed with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "So you're the one buying the Riverside parcel," she said, making it sound like an accusation rather than a statement. As she flipped through the contract pages, I noticed how quickly she skimmed past the appendices, barely glancing at them before initialing each page. My father's prediction was proving correct. Her confidence was making her careless. Later I learned from neighborhood gossip that Diane had tried to purchase the same property months earlier, hoping to build a new clubhouse, but her offer had been rejected. My wife, Olivia, a talented graphic designer who works from home, and I spent countless evenings designing our dream house, a modern craftsman with plenty of natural light. For her studio, we were so excited about our future home that we failed to notice the disapproving glances from HOA board members when we attended our first community meeting. During that meeting, Diane made several pointed comments about outsiders building in their community, clearly aimed at us, though we'd followed every regulation to the letter. As we were leaving, Derek Collins, a friendly neighbor and retired military man, quietly warned me, "Watch your back with the HOA, they rule with an iron fist around here." I nodded politely, but wasn't overly concerned. We had a legally binding contract. After all, that confidence wavered slightly when I accidentally overheard Diane speaking with Thomas Wilson, the HOA vice president, in the parking lot after the meeting. "Don't worry," she said in a hushed tone that carried in the evening air. "We have ways to make him want to sell that land back at our price." I sat in my car for a long moment, processing what I just heard, before calling my dad. His response was immediate and reassuring. "Sounds like it's time to prepare Plan B like we discussed. And remember, document everything." Little did I know, Then, just how valuable that advice would prove to be. The next few weeks were deceptively quiet. Olivia and I continued perfecting our house plans, working with an architect who specialized in energy-efficient designs. We wanted a home that would blend with the natural environment while incorporating cutting-edge sustainability features. Our excitement grew as each revision brought us closer to our vision. An open-concept main floor with large windows facing the small stream at the property's edge, a dedicated office space for my remote work, and a light-filled studio where Olivia could pursue her graphic design projects. The house wasn't extravagant by Pinterest standards, approximately 800 FT, but for us it represented the culmination of years of hard work and saving one evening. As we were finalizing the placement of the house on our lot, a knock came at our apartment door. It was Derek, looking uncomfortable and clutching a small paper in his hand. "Thought you should see this," he said, handing me what appeared to be part of the HOA newsletter. There, in a section titled President's Corner, was a thinly veiled reference to new property owners with grand plans that may not align with our community standards. The article went on to emphasize the importance of maintaining the exclusive character of Pinterest estates and protecting our community from inappropriate development. Though we weren't mentioned by name, the timing made the target obvious. They've never done this before, Derek commented. Usually they welcome new homeowners, but this, he shook his head. Just be careful. The battle began in earnest when I submitted my building permit application to the city planning department. What should have been a straightforward process turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. My application was repeatedly rejected for increasingly trivial reasons. The elevation drawings were not to scale. They were. The environmental impact statement needed additional clarification, despite being more comprehensive than required. And on. After the fourth rejection, Olivia did some online investigating and discovered that Scott Taylor, the city planning officer handling our application, was a regular golfing buddy of Thomas Wilson. There was a photo of them together at a local charity tournament, arms around each other's shoulders, looking like lifelong friends. The connection couldn't have been more obvious. While fighting the permit battle, we received our first official HOA violation notice, a sternly worded letter claiming our undeveloped property was improperly maintained and negatively impacting community aesthetic standards. The fine was $100 per day. Until the violation was corrected, it wasn't a huge amount, but the principle of it infuriated me. How could an empty piece of land that we hadn't even broken ground on possibly violate maintenance standards? When I called the HOA office to inquire, I was transferred from person to person, each one unable or unwilling to specify exactly what needed fixing. Finally, Gail Simmons, the HOA treasurer, told me curtly that excessive natural vegetation was the issue. In other words, the wild grass needed cutting. Rather than argue, I hired a professional landscaping company to clear and maintain the property, going well beyond HOA standards. The crew. Mormon laughed when I explained the situation. "This happens all the time with the Pinterest HOA," he said, as his team unloaded equipment. "They've got a reputation all over the county. Last month, they fined an elderly lady for having a bird feeder that was the wrong shade of brown. When the work was completed, I took extensive photographs of the pristinely maintained property and sent them with my payment for the violation, requesting written confirmation that the issue was resolved. Diane's response came 3 days later, a tour email acknowledging compliance, nothing more. Following my father's advice, I began meticulously documenting every interaction with the HOA, saving emails, recording phone calls, legal in our state, with one-party consent, and keeping detailed notes of every conversation Olivia took on the task of researching HOA board members, creating profiles of each one. She discovered that Gail Simmons had been spreading rumors about us, claiming we planned to build a party house that would disrupt the neighborhood's peace and decrease property values. Meanwhile, Andrea Blake, a newer HOA board member and practicing attorney, had begun questioning the legality of the actions being taken against us at board meetings, according to the minutes I'd requested. At the next monthly HOA meeting, I raised my hand during the open forum segment and calmly asked about the selective enforcement of maintenance rules. I've noticed that the vacant lot on Maple Drive has much higher grass than mine did when I was cited, yet no violation has been issued. Is there a reason for this discrepancy? The room fell uncomfortably silent. Diane cut me off mid-sentence, her voice sharp. That's not an agenda item for tonight's meeting. Mr. Miller, if you have concerns about violations, please submit them in writing to the board. When Andrea attempted to suggest a review of the violation policies, Diane quickly moved to the next agenda item, ignoring her completely. As I was walking to my car, afterward, Thomas Wilson approached me. In the darkened parking lot, he was tall and imposing in his expensive suit, the kind of man used to intimidating others to get his way. "A word of advice, Miller," he said, his voice low but threatening. "Sell the land back to us, we'll pay a fair price. It would be easier for everyone." When I politely declined, his false friendliness disappeared. "Then let's see who has more staying power. We've been here for the long haul, while you're just temporary." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The battle lines had been drawn, and it was clear the HOA was willing to play dirty. The next day, I received another violation notice, this time for unapproved signage on our property. The sign in question was the small survey marker our architect had placed to indicate the planned house location, a standard practice, and certainly not what anyone would consider signage. Nevertheless, I removed it rather than fight another pointless battle that weekend. Olivia and I visited the property to find tire tracks cutting deep ruts across what would eventually be our front yard. When I emailed photographs to the HOA asking if they knew who might be responsible, Diane replied that many residents enjoy recreational vehicles and suggested we install a fence if we were concerned, conveniently ignoring the fact that the HOA guidelines prohibited fencing on undeveloped lots. My architect, increasingly frustrated by the permit delays, suggested we hire a specialized permit expediter, someone familiar with the city's planning department, who could help navigate the increasingly bizarre roadblocks. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted during a particularly disheartening meeting. "It's like they've created a special category just for your application." The expediter, a retired city planner named Jim, reviewed our situation and shook his head grimly. "You've got connections working against you," he confirmed, "but everyone leaves a paper trail. Give me a week to see what I can find." True to his word, Jim uncovered internal emails showing that our application had been flagged with a special note to route all decisions through Scott Taylor, personally highly unusual for a residential permit. Though the emails didn't explicitly mention delaying tactics, the pattern was clear to anyone familiar with the system. Armed with this information, I scheduled a meeting with the department head, bypassing Scott Taylor entirely. I didn't directly accuse anyone of misconduct, but I did express concern about the unusual handling of our application and the excessive delays compared to similar permits, whether the department head was genuinely unaware or simply unwilling to become embroiled in potential impropriety. The result was immediate. Our permit was approved within 48 hours with a personal call from the department head apologizing for the miscommunication. After months of persistence and multiple revisions, I finally received my building permit. The victory felt significant. Maybe now we could actually start making progress on our dream home. I scheduled the construction company to deliver materials and begin site preparation. The following Monday, I called Olivia from the city planning office, unable to contain my excitement. "We did it. Construction starts next week." She squealed with delight, and for the first time in months, it felt like things were finally moving forward. But my optimism was short-lived. The very next day, a bright orange notice appeared at the entrance to the private road leading to our property. "Road maintenance in progress. No access for 3 to 4 days." I immediately drove to the HOA office to request details about this sudden road maintenance project. Diane was conveniently in a meeting, but the administrative assistant couldn't provide any information about the maintenance schedule or scope of work. When I asked to see the maintenance plan, she nervously explained that she didn't have access to those documents. I requested that Diane call me to discuss the timing, emphasizing that we had contractors scheduled to begin work. She promised to pass along the message, but Diane never called. I had to pay the construction company a substantial cancellation fee and reschedule for the following week, hoping the road would be open by then. 5 days passed, and the barricades remained in place with no visible work being done on the road. No construction equipment, no workers, not even survey markers, just the barriers blocking access to my property. When I called the HOA office again, Diane finally took my call. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Miller, but unforeseen issues have arisen with the maintenance project," she explained with transparent insincerity. "We can't provide a definite completion date at this time." When I pressed for details about these unforeseen issues, she became evasive. "It's complicated engineering concerns. I wouldn't expect someone outside the field to understand." Before ending the call, I specifically requested documentation of the maintenance project and contractor information. Her response was immediate, that information is only available to board members. Following a suggestion from Derek, I hired a drone photographer to document the maintenance area. The aerial photos confirmed what I suspected. There was absolutely no work being done. The road was completely unchanged from before the barriers went up. Armed with this evidence, I consulted with my father, who advised sending a formal letter demanding the removal of the barriers and citing my easement rights from the purchase agreement. "They're testing how far they can push you," he said. "It's time to push back." I drafted a strongly worded letter threatening legal action if access wasn't restored within 48 hours. The letter was delivered by certified mail to every HOA board member's home address. The next day, I received a call from Thomas Wilson. "The road will be reopened tomorrow," he said coldly, "but the board has voted to implement new road renovation regulations. As a community, we need to protect our infrastructure." A knot formed in my stomach. Something in his tone warned me that this wasn't a concession but a prelude to something worse. My suspicion proved correct. When 3 days after construction finally began on our foundation, I arrived at the property to find something that made my blood run cold. Overnight, the HOA had constructed a permanent concrete barrier across the private road, completely blocking all access to my land. A large sign declared, "Public road safe property, no trespassing." I felt something inside me snap. Years of saving, months of planning, all potentially ruined by these power-hungry neighbors. In a moment of pure rage, I drove directly to Diane's house, pounding on her door, until she answered, "You can't do this." I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. "We have legal easement rights." Diane merely smiled, that same cold smile that never reached her eyes. "The board voted unanimously that the road is exclusive HOA property. Your easement doesn't apply anymore." Derek, who happened to be walking his dog nearby, gently pulled me away before I said something I would regret. "Not like this, Ethan," he warned. "This is exactly what they want, to provoke you into doing something they can use against you." That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced our rental apartment feeling trapped and defeated. "Maybe Thomas is right," I said to Olivia, my voice hollow. Maybe we don't belong here. Maybe we should just sell and find somewhere else. She looked up from me, her laptop hurt, flashing across her face. You think we should just give up after everything we've invested? I snapped back, uncharacteristically. What do you suggest we do, Olivia? They've cut off our access. We can't even reach our own land. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. We rarely argued, and I was taking my frustration out on the person who least deserved it. Later that night, unable to sleep, I drove to our property and climbed over the barrier, sitting alone in the moonlight on what should have been the site of our future home. Maybe I don't belong here, I whispered to myself, the weight of defeat crushing down on me when I returned home well after midnight. I found Olivia still awake, not angry, but more determined than ever. We're not giving up, she said firmly, showing me the research she'd been doing while I was gone. They're bullies, Ethan, and bullies only win when we let them. Her strength rekindled something in me. The next morning, I called my father. Dad, they've built a permanent wall. We need to activate the contingency plan. There was a pause, then he replied, I'll be there tomorrow morning. They've just made exactly the mistake we anticipated. The following day, my father arrived at our apartment, legal briefcase in hand, and a confident smile on his face. He, Olivia, and I spread documents across our dining table, reviewing the situation and finalizing what Dad called the counter-strike. He pulled out the original purchase agreement, flipping to a section I'd almost forgotten about. Appendix 7, remember this? He asked, pointing to a clause buried deep in the legal language. It read, in the event access rights are denied by any HOA action, the buyer maintains the right to activate the alternative access easement through Lot 237B without additional compensation. Lot 237B, as it turned out, was a narrow strip of land running directly through the center of the HOA community right. Past the homes of Diane Thomas and Gail, this detail had been clearly disclosed in the contract appendices that the HOA had signed, but apparently no one had bothered to check what they were approving. As we discussed our next move, I experienced a moment of profound doubt. The stress of the past months weighed heavily on me, and the prospect of further confrontation seemed overwhelming. I don't know if I can keep fighting this battle, I admitted, my voice low with resignation. Everything feels like too much. My father looked at me with understanding in his eyes. You know, in my first year practicing law, I lost a case because I didn't read the fine print carefully enough. That's why I always tell you details matter more than anything else. He squeezed my shoulder. We prepared for this. Ethan, they're doing exactly what we anticipated. Olivia surprised me by revealing she'd been conducting her own investigation. I met with Andrea privately last week. She said she told me Diane is terrified of losing control. That's her weakness. She can't stand a thought of not being in charge. My wife's initiative reminded me why we made such a good team. Gradually my determination returned, replacing fear with a renewed sense of purpose. All right, I said, straightening the papers before me, let's show them just how prepared we are. We drafted a formal notice to the HOA activating our right to the alternative access easement. The letter included a detailed map showing how our new proposed access road would cut directly through the heart of the community, passing within feet of several board members' properties. The final paragraph read, as previously agreed to by all parties, construction will commence in 7 days. We sent copies to every HOA board member and all property owners potentially affected by the new route, ensuring maximum visibility. The reaction was immediate and exactly what we had hoped for. The next morning, I received a call from an agitated Diane Foster demanding an emergency meeting that evening. The community center was packed. When we arrived, not just with board members, but with curious residents who had received our notice. Thomas Wilson sat at the board table with a stern-looking man he introduced as the HOA's attorney. I had brought my own legal counsel. My father, whose 50 years of real estate law experience made the HOA attorney look like a nervous intern. By comparison, the meeting began with Thomas trying to intimidate us with complex legal jargon, abutment limitations and community covenant priorities, but Dad methodically dismantled each argument using the HOA's own signed documents against them. Andrea Blake, seated at the board table, stunned everyone by speaking up in our defense. "I've reviewed the documents thoroughly," she stated clearly. "The Millers have every legal right to pursue this alternative access route under the agreement we signed." Thomas shot her a venomous look. "Your loyalty should be to this board, Andrea, not to outsiders." Several residents murmured their disagreement with Thomas's statement, and I could sense the growing division within the room. Diane, clearly unaccustomed to having her authority questioned, lost her composure. "We have done everything to protect your property values," she snapped at the assembled residents, "and this is how you thank us." As the meeting progressed, the HOA's position weakened visibly. During a brief recess, Thomas approached me with what he clearly thought was a generous offer. They would purchase my land for 20% above market value. I declined, politely but firmly, then detailed my plans for the new access road, including multiple daily construction trucks that would be passing through the community center for several months. The residents' expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as they realized the disruption this would cause. The HOA had backed themselves into a corner, and the community knew it. After the meeting, Diane asked to speak with me privately, suggesting we could find a win-win solution. I agreed to meet, but insisted that Olivia and my father join us as we were leaving. Andrea pulled me aside. "I've been looking into the HOA's financial records," she whispered. "There are some irregularities. You should know about the emergency." Meeting marked a turning point, not just in our battle with the HOA, but in the community itself. For the first time, residents were questioning the board's decisions openly. Several people approached us afterward expressing support and sharing their own frustrations with the current leadership. One woman, who introduced herself as Barbara, had lived in Pinehurst for over 15 years. "This place used to be about community," she told us sadly. "Now it's just about power. Diane and her friends forget they were elected to serve us, not rule us." She wasn't alone. At least a dozen other homeowners exchanged contact information with us, forming the nucleus of what would become an informal coalition for HOA reform that night. As we strategized our next steps, Dad reminded me of the importance of maintaining the moral high ground. "They want to provoke you into doing something rash," he cautioned. "Don't give them that satisfaction. Every move we make needs to be legally impeccable and professionally executed." His words reminded me of the chess games we used to play. When I was younger, his favorite lesson had always been that emotion makes for poor strategy. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about changing a dysfunctional system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. Our strategy session was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Derek, who had overheard some disturbing news at the local golf club. "They're getting desperate," he reported, accepting the coffee. Olivia offered Thomas was talking to some contractors about doing emergency landscape improvements along the property line, basically creating a berm to block any alternate access. "You might try to create this advanced warning," gave us precious time to document the current property boundaries with photographs and drone footage, establishing a clear before record in case they attempted any alterations. As Derek was leaving, he hesitated at the door. "Be careful," he warned. "Diane's been asking questions about your daily routines when you come and go. I don't know what she's planning, but it feels invasive." The private meeting with Diane took place the following afternoon in a small conference room at the community center. Thomas was there, too, looking considerably less confident than usual. I brought Olivia and my father as planned. "Let's be reasonable." Diane began, her tone artificially pleasant. There's no need for all this conflict. She revealed that the board had long planned to build a new clubhouse on my property, a project that would significantly increase property values, particularly for homes near the facility, which happened to include those owned by board members. I'm prepared to offer you an exclusive contract to build the clubhouse if you'll sell us the land, she said, sliding a document across the table. It would be quite lucrative for you. I glanced at the figures. It was indeed a generous offer, one that would have been tempting under different circumstances. But this had long since stopped being about money. I appreciate the offer, I replied, sliding the document back. But we bought this land to build our home, not as a bargaining chip. Diane's pleasant facade cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. You don't understand how many years I've put into building this community, she hissed. No one gets to ruin it. At that moment, I glimpsed the true Diane Foster, not a community leader concerned with property values, but someone obsessed with control, someone who couldn't bear to lose. Later that evening, an unexpected scene unfolded at the Foster residence. Diane sat alone in her home office, phone pressed to her ear. Frank, you don't understand what I have to do to maintain control around here, she said to her husband, who was away on one of his frequent business trips. Everything will fall apart if I give in just once. Frank's tired voice carried through the speaker. Maybe you should consider whether all this is worth it. Diane, perhaps it's time to let go. Her response was instantaneous and revealing. Nobody understands I'm the only one who can keep this place running properly. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and Diane's next move proved just how desperate she had become through connections at her former real estate firm. She reached out to Apex Construction, a major developer in the area. While the company itself was legitimate, some of its subcontractors were known for handling special jobs, the kind that operated in legal grey areas. 2 nights later, I received a frantic call from Derek. You need to get to your property now. Someone's messing with your construction equipment. By the time I arrived, the damage was done. Hydraulic lines cut on the excavator. Electrical systems sabotaged in the temporary construction office. The construction foreman estimated it would set us back weeks and cost thousands to repair. I had anticipated something like this might happen and had installed motion-activated security cameras around the property perimeter. The footage clearly showed 2 men in dark clothing disabling the equipment, then leaving in a van with a partially visible license plate. I didn't confront Diane directly. That would have played into her hands instead. I took the footage directly to the police, filing a formal vandalism report. A detective called me the next day to confirm that the vehicle was registered to a subcontractor frequently employed by Apex Construction. I provided contact information for company executives and mentioned that they might want to look into who had recently hired this particular subcontractor. The detective understood my implication and promised to investigate thoroughly. Meanwhile, Olivia had been building alliances within the community. Andrea provided her with financial records showing that Diane and Thomas had been using HOA funds for personal expenses for years. Everything from business dinners at expensive restaurants to office equipment delivered to their homes. My wife organized a small gathering of dissatisfied HOA members, sharing these findings and discussing the possibility of a formal audit, and leadership recall the group grew with each meeting as more residents learned about the board's mismanagement and the vendetta against us. Just as momentum was building for a community-wide confrontation, we received an unexpected letter from the HOA after careful consideration of community needs. It read, "The board has voted to remove the concrete barrier and restore your original access easement effective immediately." Olivia was ecstatic, throwing her arms around me when I read the letter aloud. "We won," she exclaimed. But my father and I exchanged skeptical glances. "Too easy," Dad said, echoing my thoughts exactly. "They're planning something else," his caution proved prescient when Derrick called late that night, his voice urgent. "Ethan, you need to know this. They just held a secret meeting and there's a document you should see." The document Derrick had managed to photograph was a proposal to redesignate the area surrounding my property as an environmental conservation zone, a classification that would make construction virtually impossible. The proposal was scheduled for submission to the County Planning Commission the following week, with support already secured from Scott Taylor. It was a clever move. I could have access to my land, but I wouldn't be able to build on it. Diane had found another way to win, or so she thought. The attempted sabotage of our construction equipment had crossed the line, and not just for us. When word spread about the vandalism, many residents were genuinely appalled. Pinarest Estates prided itself on being a safe, law-abiding community, and criminal activity, even against outsiders, threatened that identity. Barbara, our ally from the emergency meeting, organized an informal neighborhood watch focused on our property. Residents took turns driving past, at various hours, their presence discouraging any further mischief. This spontaneous show of support touched us deeply and sent a clear message to Diane that her tactics had alienated even long-time residents. The reversal on the road barrier wasn't just suspicious, it was tactically transparent. By removing the obstacle that had triggered our easement claim, they hoped to neutralize our legal leverage while simultaneously working on the environmental conservation designation. It was like watching a chess player sacrifice a pawn to protect their queen. What they didn't realize was that we were already several moves ahead. Dad had anticipated this exact scenario, which is why our purchase agreement included multiple protective clauses, not just the alternative easement provision, as he often said. Good lawyers don't just solve problems, they prevent them before they happen. Andrea proved an invaluable ally, quietly feeding us information about board discussions while maintaining plausible deniability. Through her, we learned that Thomas had personally contacted several county officials about fast-tracking the conservation zone designation, using his bank's financial relationships as leverage. The process that normally took months was being compressed into weeks through a combination of personal connections and procedural shortcuts. This accelerated timeline confirmed our suspicions. They were racing to block our construction before we could establish any more concrete presence on the property. What they didn't know was that we had our own connections at the county level, including a former client of my father's, who now sat on the Environmental Review Board with Derrick's photographs as evidence of the secret meeting and Andrea's confirmation of the board's intentions. We began preparing our counter-strategy. Dad consulted with several colleagues from his law firm days, ensuring that our response would be legally bulletproof. Olivia, who had become surprisingly adept at community organizing, coordinated with our growing network of supportive residents, and I focused on documenting everything, creating a comprehensive timeline of events, collecting statements from witnesses and securing copies of all relevant communications. If this was going to become a legal battle, we would be armed with overwhelming evidence of bad faith actions by the HOA. Board Diane's facade of civic-mindedness was crumbling rapidly at a local charity event that weekend. She publicly snubbed several residents who had spoken in our favor at the emergency meeting, her increasingly erratic behavior snapping at volunteers, making thinly veiled threats about property reassessments for those who opposed her only accelerated the erosion of her support base. Even Gail Simmons, her longtime ally, seemed uncomfortable with the escalation, quietly distancing herself from some of the more aggressive plans. The cracks in their united front were beginning to show, and the timing couldn't have been better for what we had planned next. With the HOA's environmental conservation plan revealed, we had little time to respond. My father pulled out the final piece of our legal strategy, the last clause in the purchase agreement that even I had almost forgotten about. "Remember Appendix 7, he asked, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. there's one more provision we haven't activated yet." He pointed to a paragraph near the end. "In the event land use rights are restricted by any zoning changes subsequent to purchase, the buyer maintains the right to enforce control over Lot 248C. Lot 248C, as it turned out, was the artificial lake at the center of the community, the crown jewel of Pinnerest Estates, and the feature that most significantly boosted property value. My mind flashed back to a year earlier, sitting with my father in his home office as we drafted the purchase agreement. "They'll never approve a clause about the lake, Dad," I had said. Skeptically, Dad had just smiled knowingly. "They'll never read all the way to Appendix 7, and if they do, they won't understand the real implications of it." He had been right. Diane's arrogance had been her downfall. She had been so confident in her authority that she hadn't bothered to read what she was signing or to have a good attorney review it properly. I called for an all-hands meeting of the entire HOA membership, insisting that all residents be informed. Notices went out to every household, emphasizing the importance of full attendance. The day of the meeting arrived and the community center was filled beyond capacity. Diane sat at the board table, looking smugly confident she believed her environmental conservation plan had checkmated us. She had no idea what was coming. I began by addressing the gathered residents directly, bypassing the board entirely. "I'm here tonight because your leadership has been engaged in a systematic campaign to prevent me from building on land I legally purchased." I started my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Tonight I'm going to show you exactly what they've been doing and what they've kept hidden from you for the next 30 minutes. I methodically presented evidence of the board's actions, the selective enforcement of rules, the fraudulent road maintenance, the concrete barrier, and finally, the planned environmental conservation zone. The residents' expressions shifted from skepticism to shock and then to anger, not directed at me, but at their own leadership. Then came the moment we had been building toward. I displayed the original purchase agreement on the room's projector screen, highlighting the final clause in Appendix 7 that the board had signed this provision. I explained, "Gives me control over Lot 248C, the community lake. If my building rights are restricted by zoning changes," my father stood to explain the legal history. "When this community was developed, the lake parcel was actually part of the larger property that includes the miller's land. The developer only leased the lake to the HOA under special conditions that were transferred to Ethan when he purchased the property. The board officially acknowledged this arrangement when they signed the purchase agreement last year." I watched Diane's face as comprehension dawned, pure shock, giving way to disbelief, then to horrified understanding. "You can't possibly," she sputtered, rising from her chair. "That contract is fraudulent." Thomas jumped in with accusations. "Miller tricked us. This is clearly illegal." But Andrea and her attorney friend quickly confirmed that everything was legally binding. The HOA had indeed signed away their rights to the lake if they attempted to prevent me from building. The meeting erupted into chaos as residents demanded explanations from the board. One elderly gentleman stood up and addressed Diane directly. "We trusted you to act in the community's best interest, not to wage personal vendettas." Others joined in calling for immediate resignations as the uproar continued. I unveiled the final revelation. Not only did I have evidence of the board's financial improprieties, but I also had proof that Diane had deliberately colluded with Scott Taylor to block building permits for projects that competed with her real estate interests throughout the county. "Mr. Taylor is currently under investigation," I informed the stunned crowd, "and I've been cooperating with the authorities." Thomas turned pale, while Gail began gathering her papers, clearly wanting to distance herself from what was quickly becoming a sinking ship. Once the initial shock subsided, I proposed a settlement the HOA could retain control of the lake if they permanently removed all barriers to my property access. 2, cancelled the Environmental Conservation Zone Proposal 3, refunded all violation fees with interest. 4, compensated me for construction delays and vandalism damages. And 5, the entire current board resigned immediately. The residents voted overwhelmingly to accept my proposal, with several people spontaneously nominating Andrea Blake to lead a transitional board, as Diane Thomas and Gail were essentially forced to surrender their positions. Diane leaned close as she passed my chair. "You have no idea what you've just done," she whispered venomously. I was the only one who could keep this place running properly. The meeting stretched late into the night as residents processed the revelations. After the official business concluded, many stayed to share their own experiences. With the board's overreach, the stories formed a disturbing pattern of favoritism, intimidation, and petty retribution. Spanning years, one resident, a retired judge, expressed what many were feeling. "We've been living under a miniature dictatorship, and most of us were too busy or too intimidated to notice. As people gradually dispersed, there was a palpable sense of community renewal, as if a long-dormant spirit of neighborliness had been reawakened. Later that night, a small celebration took place at our apartment just. Olivia, my father, Derek, Andrea, and a few others who had been crucial to our efforts. The mood was one of relieved exhaustion rather than triumph. I never wanted this to become such a battle. I admitted as we raised our glasses in a quiet toast, all we wanted was to build our home. Andrea, who had risked her professional reputation by standing against the board, nodded sympathetically. Communities should lift each other up, not tear each other down. Maybe now we can start rebuilding in more ways than one. 3 months later, construction on our dream home was well underway. The foundation was complete, the framing was up, and for the first time since we'd purchased the property, it actually felt real. Andrea Blake, as the new HOA president, had implemented sweeping changes, revising many of the more restrictive regulations and establishing transparent processes for community decision-making. Many residents who had previously kept to themselves, intimidated by the old regime, began reaching out to us, some even offering help with various aspects of our construction. Derek had become a regular visitor to the building site, often bringing cold drinks for the workers. Andrea invited me to join the HOA planning committee, but I politely declined, offering, instead, to serve as an occasional advisor when needed. There should be a separation between the HOA and me. For a while I explained too much history. She understood, thanking me again for exposing what had been happening. The community needed this reset. She admitted, "I just wish it hadn't required such drastic measures to make it happen." Under her leadership, the HOA began conducting regular financial audits and publishing the results to all residents, a transparency that had been sorely lacking under Diane's administration. A scene unfolded at the Foster residence that perfectly encapsulated the fall from power. Diane and Frank were loading boxes into their SUV, preparing to move to another state. Neighbors watched silently from a distance. "No one offering to help you could have let go sooner." "Diane," Frank said, struggling with a heavy box, "sometimes control isn't everything." Diane's expression was a mixture of bitterness and wounded pride. "They'll see no one could run things as well as I did." She glanced around at the neighbors deliberately, avoiding eye contact with her, the social ostracism clearly painful for someone who had once wielded so much influence. We hosted a housewarming party once the exterior of our home was completed, even though the interior was still being finished. Nearly everyone from the community attended, a stark contrast to the divided neighborhood we had encountered upon arrival. During the celebration, I found a quiet moment to speak with Andrea privately on our newly built deck. "Thank you for standing up when things got difficult," I said, offering her a glass of champagne. Not everyone would have had that courage, she smiled, looking out over the neighborhood. I've always believed that communities are about mutual respect, not control. We're going to do better now. I returned, her smile sensing a genuine ally. I believe you'll be an excellent leader if you ever need support. Just let me know, my father, who had driven up for the party, raised his glass in a toast that drew everyone's attention. Sometimes, folks, justice comes, not from luck, but from careful preparation. Diane dug her own grave when she signed. Without reading, the crowd laughed now, able to find humor in what had been a tense situation. Dad winked at me, the private joke between us still bringing satisfaction. Months after the fact, Derek approached me later confessing that he had become more outspoken at HOA meetings. Your story taught me that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, he said, clinking his beer bottle against mine from our new front porch. Olivia and I could see the community lake, the property we had technically gained control of, and then returned to the community a small sign near the water, read, "Sponsored by the Miller family." A subtle reminder of the battle we had won. Do you regret any of it? Olivia asked, leaning against me as the sunset painted the water in brilliant orange and pink. I shook my head, smiling. Not at all. Sometimes you have to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't fight for themselves. A letter from lawyers representing Scott Taylor and Diane Foster demanding removal of the lake sign arrived in our mailbox. That week, I just laughed and tossed it into the recycling bin. As twilight descended, I shared a beer with Derek, who had become a close friend through our ordeal, he said, gesturing with his bottle. I still can't believe Diane didn't read the details before signing. I laughed, remembering my father's words. That's what my dad always says. The most arrogant people often end up signing their own downfall across the lake. Diane's former house displayed a Forale sign, and word from Andrea was that she was moving to another state. Sometimes justice isn't just served, it has lasting consequences, and that, my friends, is sweeter than any contract I've ever signed. For those wondering about Scott Taylor, the city planning officer, he was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into permit favoritism. Thomas Wilson resigned from his banking position to pursue other opportunities after certain financial irregularities came to light, and Gail Simmons, once the neighborhood gossip queen, found herself on the receiving end of the community's collective cold shoulder. As for us, we finally moved into our completed dream home 6 months after that fateful HOA meeting, the first night, as Olivia and I sat on our porch overlooking the peaceful lake that had almost cost us everything. She raised her wine glass to details. She toasted with a smile, and to never underestimating the Millers, I couldn't have said it better myself. The transformation of Pinnerest Estates continued in the months that followed. Under Andrea's leadership, the community instituted term limits for board members, created a transparent appeals process for HOA decisions, and established a community oversight committee to review financial expenditures. The clubhouse that Diane had once envisioned on our property was eventually built, but on a different parcel purchased through proper channels and with full community input regarding its design and use. Ironically, the architectural firm Olivia recommended was selected for the project, creating a facility that better served residents' actual needs rather than just enhancing nearby property values. Our story became something of a local legend, occasionally referenced in regional real estate seminars as a cautionary tale about HOA governance gone wrong. Dad was invited to speak at several legal continuing education events, sharing the experience as a case study and preventative legal strategy. The best contracts, he would tell attendees, anticipate human nature as much as they address legal technicality. His practice saw an uptick in clients seeking review of HOA documents before purchasing properties, a service he provided with particular satisfaction, often recounting our experience as an object lesson in the importance of thorough due diligence. Perhaps the most significant outcome was the subtle but profound shift in how the community functioned. Neighbors who had previously interacted only through formal complaints or at mandated meetings began organizing informal gatherings, book clubs, gardening exchanges, impromptu cookouts. The rigid formality that had characterized Pinarest under Diane's leadership gave way to a more natural, organic sense of community. Children played together in front yards that had previously been showcases rather than living spaces. The neighborhood had rediscovered its soul 1 year after our confrontation. Pinarest Estates held its first Founders' Day celebration, not commemorating the original development of the community, but rather its rebirth. As I watched neighbors laughing and connecting, I reflected on how our private battle had ultimately benefited everyone. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting your own interests.